Well, welcome for the final segment. We're picking up with section 5D, new technology employed in the war. We're talking about World War I, of course. And the First World War saw a number of new technologies used, and it's part of the reason there was so much death and destruction in World War I. The mobility of the airplane and of armored vehicles in the Second World War changed the game, so to speak. In the First World War, the tank was introduced, the airplane was introduced. The airplane was used mostly for reconnaissance, or in other words, to scout enemy positions, bring that information back to their command headquarters. The dogfight was largely about knocking out the other observers from the sky. And we talked about gas warfare, naval destroyers, which were ships that were created to search out and destroy German U-boats. A number of technologies, synchronized machine guns, which would allow pilots to shoot through their prop. Actually, it would be timed with the motor of the plane so that the rounds could get by the propeller while it was turning. So there were a number of new technologies. You see this first photo up here. You see the gas flowing downwind. That would be typical of a gas attack. This is an aerial photo, obviously, of using of poison gases. It was introduced first by the Germans in the First World War. The airplane, this is an English Sopwith Camel. Fairly common Allied airplane during the war. This is a Vickers machine gun. You can see the squad of men there. Now, the Vickers took squads of anywhere from 6 to 8. The gun itself was a 303 water-cooled unit. People really liked it because it was dependable, did not jam very often. It took one to fire, one to feed the rounds, and the rest of the crew would be there to carry the gun, the ammunition, parts, and so forth, the plate. So those were some of the new technologies employed during the war. Now this is a depiction of what a destroyer does. A destroyer is a sub-killer. They use sonar to identify where the submarine is, and then they drop depth charges. And you see this, now this photo on the right is actually, I believe, from a British naval vessel during the Second World War. But in principle, is what you find. They drop the depth charge. It's set to explode at a particular depth. There will be a certain amount of pounds per square inch at certain depths of the ocean. And when it gets to that depth, it explodes. And that is how you attempt to knock out an enemy submarine. Now, as we said, the German U-boats did a lot of damage. And so the Allies needed a way of dealing with the sub-threat. There you see gas masks, not only on the soldiers, but in this case, on the animal. The mule's got a mask as well. You don't want your pack animals dying either. You see on the right a trench. These guys look real happy here. Now, you see how on the bottom of the trench, obviously in water, in weather conditions where you have rain, melted snow, what have you, sometimes those trenches got pretty messy. Trench foot was a condition that people would get from having wet feet all of the time. It was rather miserable. But the trenches were built, again, as defense mechanisms against enemy attack. Barbed wire was strung ahead of the trenches, and they were very difficult to get by for the enemy. And that's why we say during the war, both sides kind of dug in. And through much of the war, there was not much territory gained after the initial attacks by Germany in 1914. This is General Pershing. We talked about him in the last section, last video. That is him here. He's actually, I believe, crossing the Rio Grande. This is from 1916 when he and the U.S. military were called out to deal with border issues, dealing with Pancho Villa, who was coming into the United States and causing problems in southern border towns. But one unique thing about this photograph is this guy right here, to his right, our left of the photo, that is George S. Patton, and we know him more famously as the armored commander during the Second World War. He was just a young lieutenant at the time. But this is John J. Pershing, who led the Allied or American Expeditionary Force in World War I. Now, the German offensive of 1918 helped bring things eventually to an end in World War I. In Russia, there were political problems. The Bolsheviks were taking control. They essentially had a provisional government in Moscow in 1917, and then in November of that year, the communists gained a foothold in the government. It led to a several-year civil war in what would become the Soviet Union. But one of the first things the Bolsheviks did was to pull Russia out of the war, and it allowed German troops to be freed up to move to the Western Front. And they felt that with this increased manpower, it would enhance their ability to make a move toward Paris. It talks about American contributions there at Cantigny and Belleau Wood. We're going to skip forward, though, to the Allied counteroffensive of July through November 1918. Specifically, two campaigns fought from September through November. This Saint-Mihiel campaign, where the United States captured a German stronghold in the south-central part of the line that had been held by Germany since 1914. This campaign was mid-September, September 12 through 15, 1918. And then the Meuse-Argonne, which was the final campaign of the war before the armistice was called. The Allies were driving. Interestingly about Meuse-Argonne, there were more American soldiers committed to this campaign than any single campaign in U.S. history. About 1.2 million American soldiers were a part of the Meuse-Argonne campaign in eastern France and northeast France. Some 27,000 plus Americans were killed. Also just of note, it was in 1918 that the Spanish influenza had decimated a lot of the troops in the United States and in other nations as well. That was a part of this context, very deadly flu that killed many people in 1918. Now, on the 11th of November in 1918, Germany asked for a ceasefire. And so the fighting stopped on the 11th of November, and during the ensuing months, before any treaties were signed, Woodrow Wilson, you see his portrait there on the bottom, attempted to outline a plan for world peace with his so-called 14 points. And when we get to 1919, the primary treaty between the Allies and the nation of Germany was called the Treaty of Versailles, June 28, 1919. And Versailles is sometimes blamed for helping to create the resentment in Germany that would result in World War II a few decades later. but nonetheless, the treaty called for significant German territorial losses, territory that they had gained during the Franco-Prussian War, for example, in the border regions with France. They were demilitarized. They had to stay below a certain number of troops in a standing army of armored vehicles, airplanes, and so forth. And maybe most significantly, they were strapped with the cost of reparation or paying for the damages of the war and admission of war guilt. This was especially harsh in the sense that Germany ended up facing tremendous difficulty. Their economy was broken largely, went through a severe depression during the 1920s economically, and some would argue that it created the seedbed for something like the Nazi movement to come to be. But we'll talk about that a little bit later in the course. The League of Nations was formed. By the way, the United States never entered into the Treaty of Versailles. And also an international organization called the League of Nations was formed. This was an attempt to create some kind of peacekeeping multinational organization. The United States never joined this either, despite the desires of President Wilson at the time. And the map of Europe was redrawn to a large extent because of the agreements at the end of the war. There were a number of treaties that were agreed to. And you can see Europe before World War I. You see the Austro-Hungarian Empire here. You can see the various singular nations, Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, in the Balkans region. You'll also notice that Germany and Russia are bordered, if you will, bordering each other. After the agreements subsequent to the First World War, you see Poland, an independent Poland, also the so-called Baltic states or Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. You also see the formation of a singular country, Yugoslavia, which was became a country filled with many different rival groups, if you will, in the Balkans. Well, that takes us through the end of our discussion of World War I. Make sure you get everything filled out, and we'll have some information regarding quizzes and what have you later. Have a great day.